All right, this morning we're going to talk about victims of sexual abuse, tomorrow domestic violence, and just to make sure that you know, my hope is on the last day to spend the entire time taking questions, dialoguing, whatever. So if you feel like we don't get enough question time in, we'll spend all our time doing that after all the talks. It's been well over 30 years since I first heard the words out of a young woman's mouth, "My father raped me." I was about 24. I had just finished a master's degree in psychology and was entering a doctoral program, and absolutely nothing in my personal life or my professional training had prepared me for that statement. This was back in the early 1970s, and there were basically no books at that time. There certainly were no seminars or workshops about the topic in the United States. And I did what all good students are supposed to do when they hit a wall. I went to a supervisor and said, "This is what I was told and I don't know what to do." And the supervisor said to me, "Women sometimes tell these hysterical stories, and your job is not to believe them. And if you believe them, you will contribute to their pathology." As time passed, and I think largely because of my gender, I began to hear more stories of childhood sexual abuse from women. And I made the decision at some point to listen to the women and not tell the supervisor, which probably tells you something about me. And I went back to the women and I said, "Look, I don't even know what this is. I have never known anybody who's been sexually abused," which of course I know now is not the truth, but at least at the time I thought it was. "So you have to teach me what it's like to be a little girl and be sexually abused. And I'll be your student, and then I'll try to figure out what help looks like, what healing looks like." And so that's how it started. And it's been going on for 30-some years. And for some reason, I think probably out of desperation, they agreed to that arrangement. It's not exactly what you expect to hear when you go to see a counselor. As you know, human beings do many atrocious things to other human beings, and of course, one of the most atrocious is the sexual abuse of a little child. A child, by definition, is developing in process, and any time you intrude on a developmental process of anything living, you alter the outcome. I mean, any of you who garden know that we do that when we intrude on the developmental process of a sapling, tree, or some kind of plant. The sexual abuse of a child shatters and violates every aspect of their being, their sense of self, how they think about relationships, how they think about God, and how they think about their future. And the violation forces the child to adapt in ways that turn out to be maladaptive in normal environments. So what enables a child to survive and cope with ongoing sexual abuse misfits the child for later life in many ways. Sexual abuse can be defined in the following way: any sexual activity, verbal, visual, or physical, engaged in without consent. And a child is considered unable to consent due to their developmental immaturity and the fact that they don't understand sexual behavior. When I say verbal sexual abuse, what I mean is things like sexual threats, sexual innuendos or hints, comments about a child's body, sexual harassment from someone in the home. Visual sexual abuse certainly includes things like pornographic material, but it also includes engaging the child in either exhibitionism or voyeurism. And physical sexual abuse, is a wide range of behavior: sodomy, oral sex, intercourse, fondling, digital penetration. And it's usually done by a family member or someone known to the child in a majority of cases. So it's important to note that most child sexual abuse occurs within the context of a relationship where the child should be able to expect safety, protection, and care. Now, a lot of what I'm going to say today also applies to rape, So I just want to say a little bit about that, because it's a different category in some ways. I mean, obviously an adult woman can be raped who's never been sexually abused. But in contemporary legal usage, at least in the US, rape is defined as non-consensual sexual penetration obtained by physical force, by threat of force, or at a time when a victim is considered unable to give consent. So if it's somebody who is mentally ill, somebody who is drunk, or on a drug, they are considered unable to consent. In the United States, at least 20% of adult women and 12% of teenage girls have experienced rape sometime during their lifetimes. Now, those are the statistics that we have, but at the same time, if you look at the organizations that collect those statistics or talk to law enforcement, they will tell you it's one of the most underreported crimes in the United States. So obviously those are minimal statistics and not accurate reflection. And then I just also, before we talk more about responding to and treating sexual abuse, I want to say something about sex trafficking, which is an area that I've gotten more involved in the last 10 years. I have worked with several women who are trafficking victims. They are all United States citizens. Some of them have been domestically trafficked by their family members across state lines in my country. And some of them were the daughters of immigrants who would traffic them when they would return back to their country of origin. So, for example, they might go back to the country of origin to visit the family for the summer, and they would traffic the child during that time for extra income. The United States State Department defines sex trafficking this way: commercial sexual acts induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or when the person induced to perform such acts has not attained 18 years of age. So it simply means, when we talk about commercial sexual exploitation, you're just talking about sex given in exchange for something of value. Could be money, could be clothes, could be drugs, could be food, could be shelter. And the phrase sex trafficking is very broad. It includes prostitution, pornography, child brides, stripping, live sex shows, a lot of massage parlors, brothels, escort services, nightclubs, and of course trafficking occurs on the streets as well. And victims are also found frequently by way of the internet, which some in law enforcement have dubbed an electronic red light district. Currently, reports say that up to 1 million women and children are trafficked every year across international borders. Of that number, 80% are female, 70% are trafficked for the purpose of sex exploitation as opposed to labor, and 50% of them are children. It's an underground activity, so it's very difficult to measure accurately. But according to statistics, they say that a woman or girl is sold in the developing world every 10 minutes. Obviously, we're not very good at identifying victims. Some organizations say there are about 2 million child prostitutes globally. UNICEF says 10 million. Obviously, we're facing a massive problem. Now, what I want to do is, we talked about post-traumatic stress disorder yesterday. So what I want to do is build on that, because what we have found through the years is post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis came out of trying to understand combat trauma. And over the years, as we've worked with victims of other kinds of trauma, particularly childhood sexual abuse, we have come to realize that that particular diagnosis is insufficient for what happens to someone who is chronically abused throughout their childhood. And so they are suggesting now, those who make up the diagnostic categories, that we need to consider a category known as complex trauma. And it is different, it is like and different post-traumatic stress disorder. And so I want to look at complex trauma so you have some understanding of the categories that it involves that are not mentioned when you look at the diagnostic categories for post-traumatic stress disorder. One of the important elements in determining the result in a life post-trauma is the ages and developmental stages at which the trauma occurred. And the other factor that seems to affect profoundly is whether it also occurred in the context of a relationship with a caregiver of some kind. Again, someone from whom safety and care should be expected. So you see that's quite different for a soldier who goes over into war at least 18 years of age and who is not being harmed by parents or siblings or grandparents or whatever, but by the enemy. Complex trauma includes all of the things that we talked about for post-traumatic stress disorder. But it is particularly characterized by those who have histories of interpersonal victimization and who experience multiple or repeated traumatic acts. So the trauma is taking place in an interpersonal context, and it has some chronicity to it. So for example, a woman whose parents deprived the children of food, repeatedly battered and humiliated her children. The father was violent with the mother, sexually abused his daughter. The damage of that kind of trauma ongoing in a home over several developmental stages is far more complex than what is covered in the diagnosis for post-traumatic stress disorder. So we're talking again about an interpersonal context, and it really is no surprise. I mean, it's quite logical to think that trauma has its most profound impact if it occurs in a chronic way to a child or adolescent. I mean, it seems like we're stating the obvious. So let's just stop for a minute and think about what we know and understand about what it means to be a child. First of all, children are all vulnerable. They all need our care. And when they're particularly little, if we don't take care of them, they will die. They are dependent on adult caretakers for survival. They don't know very much because they haven't lived very long. So they're vulnerable, they're dependent, and they're easily influenced. And any of you who either work with children or have raised children also know that children think egocentrically. They think they are the center of the world, right? That's why, for example, sometimes when parents divorce, children think it's their fault. Since they're the center of the universe, they are the ones who caused this. And they will say things like, if I had been good, mommy and daddy would still be together. So it's a very common mindset. So children then process sexual abuse with the same kind of thoughts. If I were not such a bad boy or girl, this wouldn't be happening. I make people do bad things. That's a very frequent thought in a child. And it's important to note that this happens partly because their thinking is egocentric, but the truth of the matter is, it also gives them hope. Because if this is happening because I'm bad, if I can figure out how to be good, I can stop it. So it gives them hope of somehow controlling the situation. We also know that children are in the learning process. They don't know very much. And so they don't really know how relationships work. They don't know how to tell good from bad when we teach them that. They don't know what it means to be male or female. And part of what parents in a normal environment do for their children is name the world. You think of being with a tiny little child, you say tree, house, boat. Well, we do that in concrete ways for children, but we also do that in very abstract ways. This is what love looks like. This is what trust looks like. This is where you should trust people. This is where you shouldn't trust people. So we're helping them name things. And of course, in the context of chronic abuse, children learn that relationships are for using others for yourself, that good is evil and evil is good, that pretending is necessary, and that they're basically trash. And those lessons do not just get dropped when they move out of the house and become adults. Those lessons become the control beliefs for the adult. So when an adult walks into your presence for counseling help with a history of childhood sexual abuse, those are the beliefs that they have. Children are developing, and again, anything growing can be shaped. So when children are growing, we are concerned about their nutrition because we know that what we put into them shapes their health, shapes their capacity to think. And we know that good nutrition as children not only shapes their present health, but it will affect their adult health as well. So we feed them healthy food. Raising children in an environment of good food like love and truth and wisdom shapes their characters. Conversely, raising them in an environment of fear and evil and deceit shapes them as well. So obviously the effects of chronic sexual abuse in the life of a child and on their adult life are profound. There's a pervasive myth about children, and we hear it again and again. People say children are resilient. And that word literally means that they recover quickly from suffering or tragedy and go back to their original shape. That's what the word resilient means. But abused children do not bounce back to the state that they were in prior to the abuse. It's not possible. Children are not resilient. Children are malleable, which means they're like clay. They can be shaped. There's a chapter in a book called Children, Youth, and Violence, The Search for Solutions, and the chapter is called Incubated in Terror. And it's written by a man named Bruce Perry, who's both an MD and a PhD. He must have liked school a lot. And he's commenting about this myth that children are resilient, and he talks about how ongoing violence literally alters the developing child. In the context of neurodevelopment, he examines how violence, such as being repeatedly assaulted by a parent, influences brain development and subsequent emotional, behavioral, cognitive, and social functioning for children. So for a dependent child to be required to find sustenance, to keep going, to cope in an unsafe, abusive, and neglectful environment, while their minds and bodies and emotions are basically being marinated in hostility and abuse and damage, and they're being perpetually shaped by evil and abuse, again, long-term consequences are simply a logical outcome. So you only need a pretty basic understanding of such things to realize the absolute ludicrous nature of saying things to adults who've grown up with this. You need to forget it. You need to put it behind you and move on. I mean, they can't. It's not possible. All right, so let me give you some of the characteristics and categories of complex trauma. One of the things we see in complex trauma, the fancy term for it is affect dysregulation, which means you can't control your feelings. People who grow up in an interpersonal environment, such as I've described, have great difficulty managing their emotional experiences. They overreact to minor stresses. They are easily overwhelmed. They have a very hard time calming themselves down, or we call that self-soothing. And they will often use self-destructive measures to calm themselves. So that's where you see things like self-mutilation, substance abuse, eating disorders, compulsive sexual activity, and things like that. Those are their attempts to manage overwhelming emotions. They have either trouble being angry, so they're not angry when they should be, or they can't modulate their anger at all, and it's always rage. They are often preoccupied with suicide or sexual thoughts, and they may often impulsively act out in risk-taking behaviors. These difficulties often interfere with the counseling process, and we'll talk about that a little bit. A second category is that people with complex trauma have an alteration in their attention. A child who lives in constant abuse has to find a way to cope, and the child can't leave. I mean, they're little, they can't get away, they're dependent. So since they cannot leave bodily, they often leave in their minds by dissociating. And so there's a way that they imagine or put themselves in sort of a trance-like state and back up in their heads away from the trauma that's going on. It's a way of not being abused while you're being abused. And the child desperately, of course, wants to believe that the abuse is not occurring. And so she looks for ways to keep it a secret from herself. That's what dissociation is. And when the body is trapped for a long time or chronically in unbearable circumstances and can't leave, the mind leaves by way of imagination and trance-like states. So the dissociative process is how the child separates the abuse from an everyday consciousness. And that's why you will often find portions of amnesia in people who've had childhood abuse that was chronic. And the other thing you will find is that rather than, and we talked a little bit about this yesterday, taking in a memory in its whole, you know, this is what happened, this is what I felt, this is who was there, this is what I saw, this is what I smelled, all of those pieces in a whole, they put it in their heads in fragments. So they don't have to look at the thing that's overwhelming them. So the visual, the emotional, the body part is all separate in the mind. Chronically traumatized adults who were traumatized as children, again, often have this amnesia, or they sometimes, if you're talking to them, you ask them a question that brings up what they've dissociated and it's pushing on the surface of the mind, you'll watch them sort of zone out, you know, and their eyes get this look, and you know they're not there. I mean, sometimes they literally can't even hear you, and you sort of have to ask them where they've gone. But they're retreating into themselves because facing the trauma is so overwhelming. That's why it's wise to deal with traumatic memories in very small doses with recovery time in between. I have also found in working with clients with complex trauma that when I say something to them, you know, often you'll give them something in a session to hold on to until the next time, or to give them hope, or a truth that you want them to remember that fights a powerful lie in their minds. It's very important usually to have them write it down, because dissociation is so automatic that even with things they want to hear and remember, it kicks in because it surrounds the topic of trauma. And so if they write it down, then they're able to remember it during the week. Some children who are being abused engage in what Judith Herman called doublethink, and she's the author of Trauma and Recovery, which is a wonderful, very classic book about trauma. But she talks in there about this overwhelming developmental task in a child who's facing ongoing incest. Because a child has to be attached to their caretakers in order to survive. But their caretakers are not safe. They're dangerous. The child has to have some sense of trust in people who are not trustworthy, a capacity for self-regulation and dealing with their emotions in a chaotic environment. So her tasks are formidable. They're frankly quite impossible. And so what children do is this doublethink thing. And what it means is that in order to preserve faith in my parents and their goodness, I reject the conclusion that they are unsafe or that something is wrong with them. So that leaves me. So something's got to be wrong with somebody, and I'm it. And if I'm it, then I can still stay attached to my caretakers. And any of you who have worked with victims of chronic abuse like this have probably had moments with them where they insist that their parents were good. Or their grandfather, whoever it was good. And you want to bang your head against the wall. You know, how can you think that? But this is why. This is how they survived. And it's very, very threatening for them to begin to pull them away from the idea that, in fact, the bad was located in the people who were supposed to be taking care of them. It takes a very long time for that to happen. A third area is alteration in self-perception. You know, obviously, a chronically abused child is going to have a negative view of themselves. They see themselves as helpless, which in fact they were, damaged, which they are, and undesirable to others. And again, they think egocentrically, so they believe they've caused the abuse and that there's some inherent flaw in them, which oftentimes, of course, the abuser tells them that's true. You know, if you weren't so bad, I wouldn't be doing this to you. You know, you're a whore, whatever. And I find in working with adults with this kind of history, that it is this place, the place where they believe that they are fundamentally flawed and that caused the abuse, that's the hardest place for the gospel to reach. They will believe the gospel, they will believe in the cross and redemption and the love of God for the entire world, but not for them because of that belief that they are fundamentally flawed. Complex trauma obviously affects relationships. Abuse involves betrayal, rejection, humiliation, abandonment, deceit. Trust seems like a really dumb thing. And being in control is really important. Here's a quote from a survivor of sexual abuse. She said this, "Trust is a really scary word. It strikes me as a very stupid thing to do. All of the adults in my life either hurt me or ignored the ones who did. I guess I actually do trust, don't I? I trust that people will hurt me." Victims have difficulty trusting others for good. They are often re-victimized and in some cases are involved in the victimization of others. The reason that they are re-victimized is because of dissociation. There's been research that has come out in recent years that the rate of rape among those who were victims of childhood sexual abuse is much higher than the rate of rape in the general population. And you see, what happens is you're walking down a dark city street and you hear footsteps. Well, what happens? You get flooded with adrenaline. You wonder who it is, what they might want to do, and how the heck to get out of there. I mean, that's the normal reaction. Well, for somebody who was chronically abused, they immediately kick into a dissociative state. And they are flooded with adrenaline, just like anybody else. But they retreat and automatically assume they're helpless, because that's what they were trained to believe by repeated abuse. And so here they have the danger signal, they're flooded with the adrenaline, and it puts them in the position of being very vulnerable instead of fleeing. Another area for those with complex trauma is somatization, which basically means that a lot of times people who've been chronically abused talk to you through their bodies. They don't have words. They've never been able to tell their story, and so they tell you through their bodies. And of course, the other piece is repeated trauma has a biological impact. The nervous system becomes over-responsive, and the body's normal, healthy response to danger is compromised, and there is a negative impact on survivors' ability to process information. And I think I said yesterday, a lot of women who have a history of chronic trauma have immune system dysfunction, which sometimes actually resolves once they do the work of therapy, which is very interesting. And these are people who have all kinds of symptoms, but when you run tests on them, you don't really find things. I mean, you might find something that's wrong, but it doesn't make sense to the medical community. So oftentimes women with this kind of response to trauma are living as adults with disbelief and judgment from the medical community. You know, it's all in your head. You're not really sick, which they are, but the source was their history and not a particular disease. Many victims hate their bodies and they cope with their bodies. They are stuck living in them, but they hate them. And so they're very self-destructive. And again, addictions to food, alcohol, sex, drugs, self-injury, and all of those things. The feelings of shame about the body are often very strong. Here's a quote from another victim. "Does anyone know what it is like to be wanted only for your body parts? Your mind, your heart, your abilities, and your interests are all irrelevant. Even your body as a whole is unimportant. Only specific parts matter. That is who you are, and that is what you are good for." Victims also have alterations in systems of meaning when they have complex trauma. And spiritually, the effects of abuse are profound. And I want to look specifically at that this morning. They have a distorted image of God, a distorted image of self, and that creates many barriers to really experiencing God's love and grace. God is seen to be someone who punishes, who's unpredictable, who doesn't care, or who's dead. And the survivors left trying to bring together two irreconcilable realities: a God who's all-powerful and all-loving, and childhood sexual abuse. I mean, how do you put those two together? And if for the survivor, either one without the other can be understood. You know, I understand no powerful, no loving God and childhood sexual abuse. That's logical. And I understand an all-powerful, all-loving God, and there's never any sexual abuse for anybody. But I don't know how to put the two existing together. Another quote, a survivor: as a child, I was betrayed, abandoned, and sexually abused, and I concluded that God was untrustworthy, that he also had abandoned me, that he was unsafe and abusive. How was I supposed to know any different? It all made sense. It all fit together. So let's look a little bit at the spiritual impact of sexual abuse. And I want to do this particularly because this isn't in the book. I think quite a few of you have read the book, Counseling Survivors of Sexual Abuse, and this part is not. I don't want to sit here and reiterate what you're perfectly capable of reading. There are three things, I think, to keep in mind as we think about the spiritual impact of chronic abuse. The first is that if you're working with an adult survivor, in many ways their thinking is frozen in time. A woman who was, let's say, chronically abused by her own father for 16 years of her childhood thinks about herself, her life, her relationships, and God through the grid of abuse. So she may have left home and had a different life and encountered situations where people actually proved very trustworthy for her, but she still doesn't trust. Or she's heard thousands of words about how much God loves her, but she still believes she's trash. She's somehow an exception to the rule. Trauma stops growth. It shuts things down. It's of the nature of death. And the input from experiences once the trauma has stopped, relationally and spiritually, do not seem to impact the thinking that originated within the child. Secondly, we have to keep in mind when an adult sits in front of us that the abuse occurred to a child. So it was processed by a child mind, not an adult mind. Children think concretely, not abstractly. They learn about the abstract from significant others in their lives. So they learn what love looks like by the concrete expressions of it in the home, or not. They learn what trust is the same way, and so forth. So they learn about intangible things through the tangible. And if those who teach them are repeatedly untrustworthy and cruel and lying and abusive, then to grasp the meaning and the living out of such words as trustworthy, safe, loving, truthful, for them feels like an exercise in the ridiculous. Many years ago, I worked with a woman who was an incest victim and also trafficked by her father. And it was at the beginning of doing this sort of work, and we were talking about love and God's love and what love is. And years later, and I realized when I was talking to her, she had no idea what I was talking about. Years later, after a lot of work, she wrote me a note, and she said, when you were trying to tell me what love was, you basically might have been trying to describe the color green to someone who had been blind from birth. Now, how are you going to do that? There's no file. There's no category. And that's what she did with the word love. Third, not only do children think concretely and learn about the abstract that way, but as adults, we are taught about the unseen through the seen. God teaches eternal truths to us through the natural world. we grasp a little bit of eternity by looking at the ocean. Or we get a glimmer of infinity by staring out into space. The scriptures teach us about the shortness of our time here by the disappearance of a vapor. And Jesus taught this way. He taught wonderful eternal truths through concrete things. I mean, he says, I'm bread, I'm water, I'm a door. We look at the seen, and it helps us understand the unseen. And of course, he's saying things like this, and we actually understand what he means when he says, I'm a door. We get that. And if you think about the sacraments, I mean, they're water, bread, and wine. The holiest of holy is brought to us through the diet of a peasant. That's how we learn. And of course, the ultimate expression of that is Jesus himself, God in the flesh, came to explain God to us. We learn about who God is by watching this man with skin on walk around in Galilee. So if we consider the combined impact of all these factors, we can see that many survivors exhibit the quality of thinking that is frozen in time. They learned repeatedly through the seen what to think about the unseen, through the concrete what to think about the abstract. And of course, this profoundly impacts a person spiritually. God is viewed through the lens of abuse, and who he is and what he thinks about the survivor is understood based on who the abuser was. They've learned about love and trust and faith and hope through the experience of sexual abuse. They've learned about the unseen through the seen. And though ordinary life, since the end of the trauma, if it has stopped, has taught them many other things that are more true to who God is, it doesn't seem to go in. And that's why you can have this experience with people who've been chronic victims of speaking the truth of Scripture to them, longing for them to understand that God loves them. And it has what I refer to as the splat effect. You give them this precious truth, you know they need it, you know it's true, you long for them to have it, and it's like it goes splat and falls off. It doesn't go in. And I find sometimes I work with survivors who can speak eloquently about the truths of Scripture, but on an experiential level, they do not have impact. On an experiential level, they live out of the context of the abuse rather than out of the truths they can articulate so well. Elie Wiesel, who was one of the foremost writers of the Holocaust, I think states the problem for victims of chronic abuse quite eloquently. And he says throughout many of his writings to the reader that we should not assume that it is a consolation to believe that God is alive. He says saying that God is alive actually states the problem, not the solution. And he struggles again and again with what he calls the two irreconcilable realities, God and Auschwitz. Each seems to cancel out the other, but neither one will go away. And either alone can be managed, Auschwitz and no God, or God and no Auschwitz. But together, how do you understand Auschwitz and God? And for survivors, the same two irreconcilable realities exist. A God who says he's loving, a refuge for the weak, a shelter in the storm, and the reality of the ongoing sexual violation of a child. Each seems to cancel out the other. Both are true. And the human mind has great difficulty absorbing both of those. What do you do with the rape of a child and the reality of a loving God? How do you manage that? And most victims will come down on one side or the other. They either have faced the truths of their sexual abuse and they do not believe that God is loving, or they believe God is loving, but they have not really looked at their story yet. Mm-hmm. So I want, before we speak to that and how to deal with that irreconcilable reality, I want to make sure that you have in your mind something more about the experience of being a child who's being abused. And I want to give you some specific examples. These are all true stories. And you think about trying to understand God in the context of these examples. Sarah is 5 years old, and her parents drop her off at Sunday school every week. And at Sunday school, she learned how to sing, "Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong, they are weak, but he is strong." Sarah's daddy rapes her several times a week. Sometimes she gets a break because he rapes her 8-year-old sister instead. She listens to the song, and it says that Jesus loves her and that he is strong. And so Sarah decides to ask Jesus to stop her daddy from hurting her and her sister. Nothing happens. And so in that little child mind, she decides, well, maybe Jesus isn't so strong after all, or at least he's not as strong as her daddy. Nothing, not even Jesus, can stop her daddy. The people who wrote the Bible must not have known about her daddy. Mary is 7. She lives in a house where people talk about God a lot, and God seems to have an awful lot of rules. And he says that children have to do whatever their parents tell them to do. Mary tries very hard to obey her mommy and daddy, because when she doesn't, daddy hurts her. And he says this is how God told daddies to teach little girls to obey. Mommy sends her to daddy when she is angry, and daddy hurts her then too, so she guesses that if you don't do what God says, he will hurt you also. And she will try very hard to be good. And this kind of thinking in victims of chronic abuse leads often to extremely high-functioning, high-achieving adults. But it's all rooted in the abuse and not healthy. Stan is a young boy whose father abandoned the family, and many nights his mother requires him to get in bed with her. And she tells him that God gave him to her to take care of her since his daddy left. She says God knew she couldn't live without him. And Stan is very angry with God, and he wonders why God demands such confusing and repulsive behavior, but he is also full of shame because he finds pleasure in it. God is an enigma at best, and at worst, cruel to children. Michael went away to overnight camp at age 7. He was scared and homesick, and his counselor paid him lots of special attention. It made him feel important. But then suddenly it got very strange and scary. The counselor would teach the Bible study at night in the cabin and then take Michael for a walk and make him do things he did not like. Now you think about those examples and you think about questions like this. What does incest teach a child about father? It teaches that fathers are untrustworthy, they have a great deal of power, they are unpredictable, they betray, they inflict pain on those who are dependent on them, they abandon them, and they deceive them. Trust is out of the question. And then we come along and say, God is your father. What does abuse teach about God? That he's cruel, that he has no power, or that he doesn't care? He certainly does not hear, or if he hears, he doesn't answer. He obviously thinks children are expendable. He doesn't keep his word because he's not who he says he is. And that, since he says he is a father, distance is very wise and trust out of the question. And what does the survivor learn about herself? That she is unworthy, that she is trash, that she is not loved and probably never will be, and praying is an exercise in the ridiculous. That she brings evil to people and makes them do evil things, and it doesn't matter what she does, nothing will change anyway. What does the survivor learn about things like trust and faith? And these are quotes from real people. Those are things you never do unless you're an idiot. Love? Love is a word you use when you want to make someone do something they don't want to do. And hope? Hope is a setup. Nothing ever changes anyway. So, in this very difficult context, what is the role of the counselor? What do we do? How do we have impact? It's obviously a massive question, but it's one I take very seriously. And I want to walk through the way I believe that God has called us to operate in this sphere. Keep in mind, again, we have a human being sitting in front of us who does not understand love or trust or safety or hope. We have somebody who, while undeveloped in every way, was taught lies repetitively during times of intense emotion with reinforcing behavior. You don't have to be very sophisticated about learning process to understand how embedded the lies are in the life of this person. So for example, we have somebody with the body of a 6-year-old and the mind and experience of a 6-year-old being repeatedly raped by an adult male who's telling her such things as, God told me to do this, God told daddies to teach their little girls this way. If you weren't such a whore, I wouldn't have to do this to you. You're nothing but trash. So how many times do you think that has to happen before that little girl is sure that those things are true? Probably not very many. And in chronic sexual abuse, this goes on for years. It becomes the overriding experience. So when she goes to church or sits with you and hears otherwise, the abuse provides her control beliefs. God is strong, but my daddy is stronger. Jesus loves the little children, but not me. Those control beliefs become the basis by which all other information is processed, which is why when you are working with somebody in this area, to initially just teach them the truth won't work because it won't go in. So what is our response? This person is struggling with who God is, how to respond to him, what does he think, what does he think about me? And I believe that the counselor becomes the representative of this God to the victim. The work of the counselor is to teach by who they are in the scene what is actually true about the unseen. The counselor's words, tone of voice, actions, body movements, responses to failure or to fear or to rage become ways that the victim begins to learn the truth about the character of God. And I believe that the reputation of God himself is at stake in us when we're doing this work. Now, words are how we do counseling. You know, they're the stuff of the trade. There are tools. But in this case, often just words, at least in terms of teaching, are initially quite meaningless and considered untrustworthy. I mean, what are words when you grew up hearing daddy loves you and then daddy raped you? We don't listen to words and trust them when those things happen. Or somebody says, grandfather says, come sit on my lap, and you show fear, and he says, don't worry, it'll be okay this time. So you sit on his lap, and it's not okay. So then you're the counselor, and you say to this person who's terrified to be in your room, it's okay, it's safe. And they go, right, I've heard that before. So our task becomes to be people who patiently live out before them, as we work with them, the character of God himself. And I first began to understand this early on in my work with victims. And I was working with a woman I mentioned earlier who had been chronically abused and trafficked by her father. And I longed for her to know the love of God. And of course, I tried telling her about it, and I realized at some point that she was sitting there politely tolerating me, and it was really having no effect at all. And I still remember very clearly going home that day and getting down on my knees beside my bed and pleading with God. If she knew how much you love her, it would transform her. Help her see how much you love her. And what I basically heard back from God was, you want her to know how much I love her? Then you go back into that relationship and you love her the same way I would. You show her how much I love her. You want her to know I'm trustworthy? Then be trustworthy. You want her to know I'm a refuge? Then be a refuge. You want her to know I speak truth and do not lie? Then speak truth and do not lie. You go in there and demonstrate in your flesh who I am to her, which of course is the incarnation. You know, Jesus became flesh to explain the Father to us. He brought down the unseen into flesh and blood. And the victim or survivor needs us to do this as well for two reasons. One is we all need that. I mean, that's why Jesus came, because we need that as human beings. That's how we learn. But secondly, the need is exponentially intensified for the survivor because they have been repeatedly taught as a child in the scene the antithesis of the truth of God. They have been steeped, marinated in lies. So they have learned about fathers and trust and love and hope and refuge from one who looked like the father of lies, not God our Father. So the unseen has been lived before her, or him, and they have learned their lesson well. But they have learned the lessons of hell, not of heaven. So if you want a victim to understand that God is a refuge, then you must be one. If you want him or her to understand God is faithful, then you must be faithful. If you want them to understand that God is infinitely patient with them, you must be patient, and then be patient some more. And I can guarantee you, if you're doing this work with people who've been chronically abused, you will get impatient. You will get tired and weary at how slow it is. And it is at that point you have a choice to either push on them to get better, which won't work, or to get back down on your knees and ask God to teach you more of himself than you already have understood, so that you can go back equipped to continue. Now, the second aspect, of course, is the work is that we do speak truth to them. It's inevitable. We don't just live truth, we speak truth. But unfortunately, we often want that to be the first and only response. We want to be able to tell them what's true and have it fix things. It doesn't work like that, as I'm sure you know. And working through the memories of sexual abuse and the lies that these people carry is very slow. But I can tell you the rewards are magnificent, because you watch light begin, just as a glimmer first, to dawn in a darkened mind and to grow in that place. But it's very different from simply saying, God says this, now go be different. And finally, after all the work with the relationship and the telling of the trauma and the grieving and going through the three-stage process that we talked about yesterday and that's in the book, there's a place where you want to begin to more explicitly confront them with the truths of the gospel. But you're doing that after this relationship, after they know that there's something about you that's different. After they begin to get, okay, I can sort of understand God's patience with me, because you were patient with me when I did this and when I failed at that and when I was mad at you and so I see that he's this. So after having lived it out, so they have glimmers of who God is from you, then is when I find that the real deep spiritual work takes place. It cannot be done early in the counseling process, because they have no hooks for it. And there I find that working with them to really understand the meaning of the cross is just a blessed experience. Because part of what they get there in that learning is that this Jesus, who suffered and was rejected and was abandoned and died, understands. He understands violation. Some years ago, I had a woman that I was seeing, and we had reached this point in her counseling, and she was working through some of the truths of Scripture. And I will often just give them a reference. I don't preach, I don't teach so much, it's not a Bible study. But I will give them a reference, and I had given her one from the crucifixion story. It was just one verse. And, I'm very prayerful about what to give them and things like that. And I sent her home, and I said, I want you to read this verse 4 or 5 times a day and ask God to show you what he wants to say to you. So a week later, she comes back into the session, and when you walk into my office, the couch is on the other end of the room, so you have to walk across to sit down. And she came in, I hadn't even shut the door. And I can rarely tell this story without crying, but she started walking across my room, and she said, I see, I understand. They took his clothes. They took his clothes. This was a woman who had grown up in a rural area, who had had more times than she could count, been stripped by a group of men, stuck naked in a circle of men, and then gang raped again and again and again. And they took his clothes. And that was that opened her up spiritually. And then she began to experientially receive. She was a pastor's wife. She knew the truths. But she experientially began to receive what God had for her. And it's a transforming thing when it happens. Part of what you're doing as you sort of begin to help them understand the cross is the cross speaks to the extent of the evil that happened to them. they feel often that evil has been minimized and not understood. The cross also speaks of the infinite love of God. I mean, they're both there at the cross. And the cross covers any evil done by the victim. Sometimes you work with victims who have abused others. And there's forgiveness at that cross as well. The cross of Christ is God with us in our suffering, in our violations, in all the things that happen. And again, I do not do this work for my clients. I structure and nudge and pray with and pray for and work with them and help them to do it, because I find it has far more power if they're immersing themselves little by little in the truths of the cross of Christ and the scriptures, and God speaks directly to them. It's very different than if I just teach it to them. And again, things make sense more at this point in counseling, because they'll read something about God entering into their sufferings, and they know that I have entered into their sufferings. They read something about the love and patience of God, and they've experienced, albeit imperfect, love and patience from me. And so they have a concrete way of beginning to grasp the experience of who Jesus Christ is to them. Okay, what time is it? All right, let me just give you a little bit more here, and then we stop for coffee. I want to give you 3 elements that I think are necessary if you're going to do this work, and do it well. The first element is that you must know and understand people, which means you have to continually be a student. You need to read. You need to understand trauma. You need to understand how it impacts children. You need to understand how it impacts adults. You need to know what it feels like to be traumatized. And even if you yourself have experienced trauma, you only know what it feels like for you. And though we can certainly give broad sweep diagnostic categories and all kinds of things, it's also unique for each person. And so you must read and study to understand people. And no matter how much you read, never assume you know. You must always carry that knowledge with humility, because again, somebody's going to come in your office and they're going to say things and you're going to think, okay, I know what to do and I know what this is. And then they're going to throw you a curveball and you're going to go, what? I never heard anything like that before. So you must continually listen from a basis of wanting to understand this person uniquely, not listen from a basis of knowledge and the arrogance that knowledge can bring. Secondly, if you're going to do this work and survive, you need to know God well. We get traumatized by listening to trauma. It's very easy to become harsh or hard or cynical or condemning or think all of a certain kind of people are abusers or burnout or something. Begin to struggle with your own faith. I mean, you can't immerse yourself in the evil done to others without being impacted. And if you can, there's something wrong. And so you cannot do this work without knowing God and knowing Him well and actively, deliberately seeking after Him on a daily basis. And so you must be an avid student of the Word, because you want His truth to permeate you, not only so you will be a representative of that truth in an accurate way, but because you need that truth to combat the lies that you hear all the time. I mean, it's not hard to begin to doubt the goodness of God if you hear enough of these stories. And so it's very important to study and sit before Him in prayer, listen to Him. And again, so we can accurately represent Him. You know, it would be rather presumptuous to say we speak for Him if we don't really know Him very well. And George MacDonald said this: if you say, the opinions I hold and by which I represent Christianity are those of the Bible, then I reply, None can understand, still less represent the opinions of another, but such as are of the same mind with him. And where are you going to find the mind of Christ? You're going to find it in the Word of God. So we need to constantly remember that according to that Word, knowing the Word includes obedience to it. That's not just knowledge, but it's knowledge lived out in our lives. And I have found it extremely helpful in doing this work. I have a small group of colleagues that I meet with on a weekly basis who also do this work, to pray together. Some of you are in isolated situations and don't have colleagues who can do that with you. You may have fellow church members where you can't break confidentiality, but you can certainly let them know of your own struggles with the work. But to have and hear people pray for you as you do this work, I think is a vital, vital thing. The other thing that I have found absolutely critical is pursuing what I call antidotes to evil. So if you're going to listen to stories of sexual abuse, they're ugly. You need to pursue beauty. One of the ways I do that is in nature. My husband and I hike a lot. It's a place that reminds me of the beauty and the order of God as I deal with ugliness and chaos in people's lives. I do the same thing with music. You know, if Bach can't remind you that there's order in the universe, nobody can. So music and nature, and then just laughter and friends to remind you that there are actually some safe people in the world. And then those that you pray with. And then finally, do not do this work, or any other for that matter, without utter dependence on the Spirit of God. First of all, you're dealing with poison. You're dealing with toxins. And they will get in you if you are not dependent on the Spirit of God. But at the same time, you know, where else are you going to find wisdom? In here? In your textbooks? They're not going to tell you when to speak and when to be quiet. How are you going to be able to tell lies from the truth apart from the Spirit in you? And how are you going to be able to love somebody who's being obnoxious, has failed yet again, and you're tired? You can't do it. How are you going to know the mind of God apart from the Spirit of God? And of course, how can we expect to demonstrate the character of God apart from the work of the Spirit in us, transforming us? You can't give the life-giving power of the crucified Christ to others unless you've let that crucifixion and cross do its work in you. You can't give what you do not have. To work with sexual abuse is to work with lies and darkness and evil. It is hell brought up from below earth's surface. And you cannot fight the litter of hell in a life without utter dependence on the Spirit of God. You will lose, you will be crushed, and you will fall. You can't bring life to a place of death without the Spirit of God. But I would also just like to close and say that I have found this work a great privilege to do. It has driven me to my knees in ways that I am so grateful for. It is a hard work, and that the task of representing God in the scene so that who He is can actually be grasped and understood and believed by someone else is really rather extraordinary. That a sinful human being can be taught to do that in some measure, however paltry. But it is, I believe, if you enter into this work, it is a work that will take you to your knees and make you have a greater hunger for God Himself, which is a redemptive thing in you brought about by this broken person in front of you. So their shattered life ends up having a redemptive impact in yours, which is, of course, is what our God does. He takes the broken and uses it redemptively. And so they came to you for help. They need the redemptive power of Christ in their lives. By God's grace, you bring it to them. But in the extraordinary way that only God can work, they bring it to you as well. And you will be blessed. And you will know Him and His work on the cross for you more clearly than you have before.